Welcome everybody from wherever you're joining us from. I see we have participants from South Africa, participants from the UK, India, all over the world, and Africa included. It is our pleasure to introduce you as the Global Rewilding Alliance to this important webinar on nature restoration and climate action in Africa. So this follows a series of webinars that we have been hosting over the past few weeks as we prepare for COP16, which is going to be held in Cali in a couple of weeks to come. And as we prepare for this important meeting and convention, it's quite important to actually talk and discuss about such key factors as the role of nature, trophic rewilding, and wildlife restoration, and how they contribute to climate action and the climate action plans that countries are going to be presenting in the important meeting. I think just a couple of house rules. Like Alistair said earlier, you are free to put on your videos so that we can see you. But if that option is not available, please, that's optional and it's okay. We will be having quite a number of presentations from a number of key policy and wildlife experts across Africa who will be presenting and giving evidence and data on how wildlife restoration has actually been noted to be a panacea towards climate action in the various landscapes that they are working in. That's your terrestrial landscapes, your freshwater ecosystems, and others. This webinar basically builds up on research that was conducted by Yale University, GRA, Rewild, and other partners, which basically showed that trophic rewilding has the potential to actually sequester 6.4 billion tons of carbon annually. And it's quite a massive number to think of it, and it actually fits in quite well to the Paris Agreement goals that we've all been hearing about and all striving and working towards. So as we are going to be starting the presentations, it is quite key to actually take into account the key points that are going to be mentioned as we prepare for COP16, which is going to be held in Cali. Without wasting much time, we are going to delve into the presentations. If I can introduce our first speaker for today, Dr. Andrew Tilker. Well, at least we wait for the other speakers to actually also just come on board. Dr. Andrew Tilker, over to you. Thank you. Andrew, if you can hear me, please feel free to take over.
Okay, great. Are you showing the presentation? Thank you so much. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for giving me the chance to speak to you today about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is animating the carbon cycle. My name is Andrew Tilker, and I am Species Conservation Manager for an NGO called Rewild. And today I want to talk to you about animating the carbon cycle and how trophic rewilding can help address global climate change. Next, please. So to meet the target of 1.5 degrees that was adopted in the Paris Agreement, we need to obtain net zero emissions, but we also need to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and store it somewhere on the planet. Now, if you run the numbers, current estimates indicate that we need a total of 400 to 500 gigatons of CO2 negative emissions between 2030 and 2100. And if you do the math, that works out to about 10 to 12 gigatons of CO2 per year. Next, please. There are a number of new and emerging and evolving technological approaches to removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And I'm sure many people on this call have heard about these technological solutions. But today I'm going to talk to you why I think nature is probably the best technological solution ever built, so to speak. Next. So one proposed way to address the climate change crisis is to use biodiversity and ecosystems, both to avoid emissions and also to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. These approaches are referred to as nature-based or natural climate solutions, and they can help us really in two ways. First, nature-based solutions can help us in avoided emissions by protecting forests and wetlands and grasslands, as well as seascapes, although that isn't shown on this figure. We can help avoid about 5 gigatons of CO2 per year. But nature-based solutions can also enhance CO2 sinks by managing working landscapes like agriculture and timber, for example, and restoring habitats. We can remove a further 5 gigatons of CO2 per year from the atmosphere. And so we're still short of the 6 to 7 gigatons that we need to aim for per year, but we're getting close to that goal. Next, please. Next, thanks. The question is, where are the animals? If you look at the figure on this slide, you see that there are domestic animals, but you don't see any wild animals. And this is an issue because animals are key components of ecosystems, and they should be part of the conversation when it comes to nature-based solutions. Next. Now, there are a few reasons why historically animals and wildlife haven't been part of this conversation, and they haven't been part of the kind of the general framework of nature-based solutions. And the problem, and one of the main reasons for this is, as you can see on the figure on the screen, is that animals are very small components of natural ecosystems. So we've all seen the classic trophic pyramid that's shown here with kind of animal predators on the top, things like ungulates in the middle, and then plants on the bottom. And if you actually calculate the biomass for each of these trophic levels, not surprisingly, animals are very small compared to plants, and as well as things like coral and marine ecosystems. And so traditionally, animals have not been seen as very important for nature-based solutions just because their biomass is so small and because they don't store a lot of carbon because of that, at least in the grand scheme of things. Next. But the problem with this approach is that it overlooks the fact that ecosystems are dynamic systems and that animals often have impacts on ecosystems that are far disproportionate to their abundance. So as you can see on the figure that I'm showing, that animals actually are involved in a tangled network of interactions that help shape the way that ecosystems function, and in turn shape the way that these ecosystems can store carbon long term. Next. This is just a slide to show some examples of how animals interact with ecosystems. Obviously, this is a terrestrial example, but animals do things like trampling, they remove vegetation. Predators can actually change the behavior of prey and therefore the way that the prey interacts in their environment, with implications on plant communities. And so there are just a variety of ways that animals interact with their environments that have direct implications for how these ecosystems function and therefore carbon sequestration. Next. And I put this slide in just to say that many of the examples that I'll talk about today are terrestrial because that's my background. But we shouldn't forget about the marine and aquatic ecosystems as well. For example, there's a so-called whale pump that describes an interconnected cycle in which whales contribute to the transport of nutrients from the depths of the ocean to the surface. And there's been a lot of research in this topic in recent years that shows that this has significant implications for carbon sequestration. Next. So I'd like to give some examples of how animals and wildlife communities change ecosystems and how that impacts carbon sequestration. So many of us know that mammals and birds are very important seed dispersers, especially in tropical systems. Large and medium-sized mammals and birds feed on fruit. The seeds pass through the animals and then they're deposited, often very far away from where the seed was consumed. And so by consuming seeds and spreading them out across a forested landscape, these animals are integral to maintaining healthy forest ecosystems. Next. A number of studies in recent years have shown that the seeds that are most likely to be consumed and dispersed by large mammals and birds are exactly from those trees that store the most carbon. These trees have large seeds that are primarily or sometimes only dispersed by large animal species, and they're characterized by dense wood that is especially important for long-term carbon storage. So there have been some neat simulation studies that indicate that with the extinction of large frugivores, both birds and mammals, the composition of forests fundamentally changes with a shift to softwood trees that store less carbon in those ecosystems. And so if this might sound minor, if you think about this from the perspective of one or two animals here or there, but if you multiply this effect over large landscapes, for example, across all of the forests of West Africa or all of the Congo Basin, the net result is significant. And so it's important to consider these dynamics when we're thinking about what are healthy forest ecosystems and how that relates to carbon sequestration. Now, this example looks at the effects of removing these animals from these ecosystems, but the opposite is also true. If we actively restore animal populations, we can help restore healthy ecosystems that in turn remove more carbon from the atmosphere, and we're getting closer to that 6 to 7 gigaton of CO2 per year target that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. Next. So animals also impact their environment through more direct means. For example, in the Congo Basin of Africa, in areas without elephants, the forest understory gets very dense and overgrown. And there were a couple studies that showed that when elephants are present, they thin out the forest, both by consuming vegetation, but also by physically creating open areas because they're very large animals. In areas with more open forest, you find more tall carbon-dense trees. And the reason is that dense, thick understory vegetation hinders the germination and growth of carbon-dense trees. And so the net effect is that in areas with elephants in this forest ecosystem, you can have more than 50% more tree biomass and therefore greatly enhanced carbon storage capacities. And so I like this example because it shows just how important in this case, a large mammal is in interacting with its environment, fundamentally changing that ecosystem, and in turn, enabling that ecosystem to have greater carbon storage capacities. Next. And you can click one more. Another example involves wildebeest in the Serengeti, and I like this story because it's a real world example of a conservation success. Around 1960, there was a disease called rinderpest that spread from domestic cattle to wildebeest in the Serengeti ecosystem. Rinderpest decimated wildebeest populations in the Serengeti. Numbers declined from about 1.4 million to about 200,000 in a very short time frame. And that's what this figure on the top right is showing. And one of the most significant changes was that because there was greatly reduced grazing pressure, there was a drastic increase in fire frequency and severity. And in these conditions, the Serengeti became a net a net source for CO2. In other words, the ecosystem was actually emitting more carbon than it stored. So if you fast forward, conservation eventually eradicated rinderpest, and wildebeest populations have since rebounded to very close to historical numbers. And because of that, the wildebeest grazed and migrated in this ecosystem as they have for millennia. And as numbers rose, there was a subsequent increase in the amount of carbon stored on the wider Serengeti landscape. And eventually, the Serengeti went back to being a net carbon sink. And the key takeaway from this story is that this happened all because there were healthy densities of animals doing what they should be doing in that ecosystem. Next. And you can click one more. So as I hope the past couple case studies have shown, it's important to put numbers to the potential effects that animals have on ecosystems within a nature-based solutions framework. And this is important for a couple of reasons. First, because it demonstrates the scope and the scale of how important animals are to nature-based solution frameworks when we're thinking about the global fight to address climate change. Animals need to be part of the conversation because they can have significant effects. And second, because quantifying these impacts helps get the attention both of policymakers as well as the general public, and that provides a foundation for a much broader conversation about the importance of animals and ecosystems for global climate change. And so with that in mind, a group of scientists led primarily by Dr. Oswald Schmidt from Yale and also Magnus Sylvan from the Global Rewilding Alliance have engaged in really pioneering work to try to quantify the impact that animals have on carbon within ecosystems, and basically to put numbers to how animals are animating the carbon cycle. And to do this, they've used very complex modeling approaches and applied this to species and ecosystems in a variety of contexts, both in terrestrial and in marine ecosystems. And I won't get into the modeling specifics on this call. It's very dense, complicated math. But if anyone has questions about kind of the underlying mechanics and the modeling approaches behind this work, you can reach out to me or Magnus or Oz directly. Next, please. And one more. So in a paper that we published a couple of years ago, we took a number of species from a variety of ecosystems and tried to put numbers to these effects, as I said. And if you put all of these effects together, we find that there's a total of approximately 6.41 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 that are accounted for just by animals interacting how they should in their environments. But what's surprising about this is that none of this is accounted for in existing nature-based solution estimates. Now, some of this might be captured indirectly in these existing frameworks, but the key takeaway here is that there's an enormous amount of carbon storage potential that's not directly accounted for in nature-based solution frameworks to the climate crisis. And this hints, I think, at the power of rewilding and conservation approaches for addressing the climate crisis, both for protecting ecosystems and also reintroducing species to areas where they've been lost or where their densities have been decreased. Next. And one more. And one more. And so from this work, from the case studies that I've presented, I hope you can see that animals are really critical components to healthy ecosystems that play an important role in maximizing carbon storage potential globally. And we need to change our mindset for how we think about animals within a nature-based solutions framework. So my colleague in the Animating the Carbon Cycle work, Dr. Oswald Schmidt, has an excellent analogy, which I'm going to borrow from him. Animals are often seen as unwitting passengers on the climate change ship, potentially heading to doom. And Oz argues, and I think this work makes a case for the fact that we shouldn't see animals as these unwitting passengers. We should see them as active agents in this story. They're passengers on this ship that can help steer the ship to a new direction. And I would argue that we need to involve animals in the conversation more broadly if we are going to meet the challenges that are so clearly evident for global climate change, and more specifically, if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree target that was outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement. Next. And so the final message that I want to leave you with today, the key takeaway, if you will, is that nature provides us with, I think, the most powerful technology ever built, so to speak, to address global climate change within a nature-based solutions framework. And animals are a key component to that framework. We need to be thinking about animals and healthy densities of animals anytime we're thinking about healthy ecosystems and how that contributes to the global fight for climate change. And there's an enormous potential, both in Africa, but also in other parts of the world, to restore animal populations through rewilding approaches, to build up healthy populations that therefore contribute to healthy ecosystems and can make a real significant difference to our global efforts to address the climate crisis. Next. And one more. And so with that, I want to thank you for your time, for your attention. And if you have any questions or want to know more about this work, please don't hesitate to either reach out to me or follow the Global Rewilding Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Andrew Tilker, for such an enlightening presentation. I can see so many comments in the chat box. This really has been unexplored territory, and the provision of data to support such, there used to be perceptions, but then now it's becoming practical evidence, informing the animating the carbon cycle theory actually become valid and more robust with such data and publications available. I think I must also hasten to say that the research that was done by Yale and Dr. Tilker and other partners is actually also available as a publication on Nature, if anyone would want to actually go deeper with the paper and analyze and understand all that data that Dr. Andrew just presented. Before we go on to our next presenter, who will be providing a case study on forest elephants, I think it's also important for us to share with all the participants that we have a website where information around animating the carbon cycle can be found. For those who might want more information, resources, and data backing the presentation which has just been made, please feel free to visit animatingcarbon.earth, which is the website we have recently launched to spread awareness and also just provide basic resources regarding how trophic rewilding can be one of the most viable nature-based solutions to manage the climate crisis. I will move on to, I will share the link to our website in the chat box for those who might want to visit it. And if you have any questions for Dr. Tilker, please also just drop them in the chat box so that we can also just get back to you regarding the responses. We'll move on to our next presenter, who is Mahin Khan from WWF, who will be presenting a case study on forest elephants, supporting the data and the science and the practice that Dr. Andrew has just presented on. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mahin.
Thank you, Nelson. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar today. My name is Mahin Khan, and I'm Senior Advisor Climate Resilience at WWF based in the Netherlands. I work on the nexus between international climate policy and ground implementation. I'm just going to wait for the slides. Is the presentation up? Thank you, Peter. I want to start with the latest figures from the Living Planet report, which was launched today. It is a biannual report by WWF and the Zoological Society of London. Global wildlife populations have plunged by an average of 73% in 50 years. Those of us who work in this sector, we are not entirely surprised by these numbers, as over the years we have been monitoring decline in biodiversity. But of course, these numbers are nevertheless shocking when they come out. WWF Netherlands recently undertook a small project that estimates the potential for conserving forest elephants and their trophic interactions, as well as recycling feedbacks to enhance carbon capture and storage. The study area that was considered is 184,028 kilometers square of the trinational Jaodzala Minkebe Tridom and Sangha Trinational UNESCO Heritage Central Landscapes in the Congo Basin. These conservative estimates are derived from the new carbon cycle model developed by Dr. Oswald Schmitz and Matteo Rizzuto from Yale University, as Andrew presented before. Next slide, please. This slide shows the main process that the model captures with regards to the trophic interactions of the forest elephants in the study area in the Congo Basin. I will not go into the very details or the mathematical calculations of the model, but I will try to give you an idea of the process that was captured. Through consumption, forest elephants obtain nutrients from the understory trees, which they feed back into the soil through their body wastes, as you can see with the arrows. The nutrients fed back to the soil are assumed in this model or in this study to be on two levels. The shallow level, which is fed back to the understory vegetation, and the deep horizon level, where the nutrients leach from the shallow level, feeding the overstory and the canopy trees. Next slide, please. To get to the main point, the study revealed that conserving forest elephants and their trophic interactions could increase carbon capture and storage by 1.77 times above the level of ecosystem capture and storage in their absence. Under steady conditions, conserving forest elephants and vegetation in the study area in the Congo Basin would lead to a total estimated average ecosystem carbon capture and storage of 974 million tons of carbon per year. Without the forest elephants, as you can see on the slide, the baseline is 548 million tons of carbon per year. Despite legal protection and conservation programs for protection, forest elephants have experienced a decline of 80 to 90% in the Congo Basin due to habitat loss, poaching, and other human activities. Forest elephants are known as ecological engineers. Through identifying their, as well as other animals, critical role in mitigating climate change and also building resilience of ecosystems, we can further strengthen and enhance the much-needed narrative of the role of wildlife in combating climate change as a natural or nature-based climate solution. Next slide, please. A conservation strategy that addresses both the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together is crucial at this juncture. Ecosystem functioning is essential for carbon capture and storage. Animals within their ecosystems play a key role in creating an enabling environment for healthy ecosystems through their interactions. The missing piece of this puzzle needs to be unearthed and remove the silos of policy and practice that largely treat the two crises separately. On this slide, and these are the assumptions of the model, of course, in the study, which had a smaller scope, as you can see that 10.5 more carbon is captured by understory vegetation in tropical rainforest with forest elephants. However, there are limitations of the study due to the scope and the expectation. is that in time, such research and projects will be increasingly highlighted and coupled with action in key biodiversity and climate vulnerable sites to begin with. Next slide, please. I want to quickly highlight some of the limitations or caveats for this study. Please note that the project results from the Congo Basin the WWF was working on are conservative estimates and yet to be peer-reviewed. However, the model that predicts the estimates is peer-reviewed and published. The data used to parameterize the study are from empirical data from previously published studies. The study is simplistic in the sense that it focuses on one species only, albeit a dominant one in the ecosystem concerned. Finally, the study is conducted under steady climatic conditions, thus climate change impacts are not taken into account. Climate impacts such as threats to food resources for forest elephants will most likely affect the estimated average, of course. This goes on to underscore the need to consider synergies and trade-offs in climate change and conservation strategies. This study is mainly commissioned, or we undertake to get these numbers to start the conversation on the importance of bridging the gap between biodiversity and climate. And hopefully we can start this movement of taking into account key role of wildlife in ecosystem functioning, which leads to combating climate change. I will stop there and I will put my contact details on chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maheen, for the presentation. I think all attendees, as you can see, what we are trying to do basically is to posit the animating the carbon cycle and also provide valid case studies of where the animating the carbon cycle is actually being practiced on the ground. Usually there's a disconnect between science, academia, and practice. But this is just one of the brilliant case studies in the Congo Basin that has just been presented. And we will be moving on to linking the whole wildlife, nature rewilding and trophic rewilding issues to climate action and your policy issues as well. So coming up next is going to be Simon Addison, who is a senior advisor on climate issues with IFOR, who will be presenting to us regarding the link between wildlife and climate action. Thank you so much. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Nelson. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone who's online, depending on where you are. My name is Simon Addison. I am the Climate Change Advisor for the International Fund for Animal Welfare, or IFOR. And as Nelson said, I'm going to be trying to link what we've heard so far from Andrew and Maheen on the science of animating the carbon cycle to the policy questions around how we can leverage wildlife conservation and rewilding and the amazing potential of animal populations for helping countries to achieve their climate and biodiversity goals, particularly under the UNFCCC through nationally determined contributions. IFOR has been engaged in research over the past 2 years, looking at the extent to which countries, particularly in Africa and other least developed countries that have high levels of biodiversity, have been including wildlife and wildlife conservation and rewilding in their national climate action plans. And we have also been developing some guidelines for how to make that possible. So I will take you quickly through presentation on why we think this is important. So 2025 marks a milestone for all countries who are signatory to the UN Climate Convention, in that each country is expected to submit a new nationally determined contribution, which the UNFCCC is referring to as NDC 3.0. NDCs, these nationally determined contributions, outline each country's plans to take action on climate change, largely focused on mitigation, but also incorporating aspects of climate change adaptation. And we believe that this provides an excellent opportunity for all countries to reconsider the role that wildlife and wildlife conservation and rewilding can play in supporting them to achieve their climate goals under the UNFCCC. Why should countries do this? We've already heard about the science, but just to recap and to make it clear, healthy wildlife populations help ecosystems store more carbon in many circumstances. Obviously, not all, but this can really help governments and their populations to deliver more and more cost-effective greenhouse gas mitigation in the forestry and land use sector. Balanced ecosystems, we know, provide critical ecosystem services for both people and nature, and these are critical for climate adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and climate resilient development, and can help increase the potential for climate mitigation in natural ecosystems. Wild animals also face significant risks from climate change. So drought conditions, for instance, can lead to death and population decline of wild animal species. And we see from the estimates of both the WWF and the IPBES that climate change is an increasing threat to wild animal populations and biodiversity. So by integrating wildlife and the potential of wild animals to support carbon sequestration and mitigation, we can, in the long term, try to build ecosystem resilience to reduce the impacts of climate change on animals, thereby safeguarding their contribution to climate mitigation and adaptation. When we shift our focus to thinking about resilience and adaptation, biodiverse ecosystems strengthen the resilience of landscapes and the delivery of ecosystem services for people and animals, and building climate resilient landscapes helps animals to deliver the benefits they provide for carbon sequestration and ecosystem health. They also enable people and economies to be more resilient to climate change. The wildlife economy delivers its significant economic benefits to communities and national economies, supporting climate resilient development and climate adaptation at local and national levels. And by protecting and expanding wild animal populations to historic levels, countries can increase economic benefits for their citizens, and increased economic security in turn supports broader resilience of households and communities. So wildlife conservation, supporting biodiversity, and building climate resilient landscapes effectively provides a foundation for resilience and adaptation of nature and wild animal populations for local economies, communities, and households. But wildlife are missing, unfortunately, from most nationally determined contributions documents. We have, as I said, conducted some research to look at this integration of wildlife into NDCs in Africa and other least developed countries. And on the right there, you will see a graph that shows the extent of the integration of wildlife conservation compared to ecosystem protection and landscape restoration. And you can see that there's a pretty low level of integration across all the NDCs that we examined. In the past few years, many countries have made a significant effort to increase the presence of nature-based solutions in their NDCs. However, we find that wild animals and wildlife conservation and this contribution that animals make to carbon sequestration, particularly through animating the carbon cycle, is not included to a very great degree. We found that 60% of African countries and other LDCs have not included wildlife conservation in their climate action plans yet. And this is a missed opportunity for countries that have high levels of biodiversity and who may have relatively limited options in other sectors for climate mitigation and adaptation. This is an opportunity for them to supercharge their climate action plans through conservation. So what can countries do? Firstly, simply acknowledge that wildlife conservation and rewilding are in fact powerful means for accelerating carbon sequestration and for supporting adaptation and resilience in particular ecosystems. They can then estimate the contribution that wildlife conservation and rewilding can make to mitigation and adaptation in each country. They can include trophic rewilding, wildlife conservation, and the wildlife economy in their NDCs as core pillars for delivering their climate goals. They should consider costing wildlife-related climate actions in ways that can help them to raise finance for wildlife sectors from climate finance, something that is not happening to a very great degree. And then use wildlife conservation to raise that carbon finance by integrating trophic rewilding into carbon projects. So we have developed 10 guidelines that can help countries to deliver this through their NDCs, and I will quickly run you through them just to give you a brief illustration of the practical ways in which each country can approach this problem. The first is to essentially build on what we've heard from Andrew and Maheen to try and establish the contribution that key wildlife species and key wildlife habitats can make to climate change adaptation in each country. We've seen this table already in terms of the specific contributions that key species can make to carbon sequestration in different ecosystem types globally. Secondly, countries can identify the major risks that threaten the wildlife populations and ecosystems that contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation. That can help to inform their action planning so that the protection and rewilding of species and the protection and conservation of habitats can be integrated into their plans to reduce impacts on biodiversity and species and to increase climate mitigation and adaptation potential. Thirdly, each country can specify the wildlife species and ecosystems that need to be protected and restored as part of its NDC commitments. They can then describe the plans that they want to put in place to include wildlife-nature interactions in their greenhouse gas inventories. This is something that is generally ignored at the moment. Both the losses that occur as a result of biodiversity loss and particularly the loss of particular animal species tend to be ignored in greenhouse gas inventories, and the potential for supporting sequestration of carbon and climate mitigation are not yet integrated into these calculations. Fifth, each country can set high-level targets for the delivery of climate change mitigation and adaptation through conservation and restoration of wildlife populations and biodiverse ecosystems. And specific actions can then be listed by each country to show how they will actually deliver their wildlife and climate targets. So here we can see a variety of different ways in which biodiversity could be integrated into national climate action plans through actions in marine and coastal zone ecosystems, for instance, wetland protection, coral reef protection, coastal zone land use planning, etc., through natural terrestrial ecosystems, through actions in agricultural ecosystems. So through all of these, we can take a wildlife lens to think about how we can support wildlife to deliver the services that they provide to climate mitigation and adaptation. It's then important to specify the financial support that is required to implement those actions that have been outlined in each NDC in ways that can link climate action and wildlife conservation. This might include a cost-benefit analysis that could help to each country to spell out the benefits that come from integrating wildlife conservation and rewilding into their climate action plans, whilst also considering the costs of losing biodiversity and wildlife species, not just simply the cost in their own terms, but the cost that each country will lose in terms of the benefits that they deliver to carbon sequestration and to adaptation through the wildlife economy. Eighth, there's an opportunity in each NDC to outline the capacity support and technology transfer that each country will require to implement wildlife-related NDC actions. I think there's generally a relatively low level of capacity in things like biodiversity monitoring, the assessment of carbon, linking wildlife populations to carbon sequestration, and making those quantifications, whether it's using geographical information systems or new developments in nature technology and biodiversity monitoring. The NDC is now an excellent opportunity to spell out the needs that each country has, particularly in its biodiversity management ministries or departments, and to build in the requirements for finance and capacity building support that each country envisages would be useful to help them meet their climate action plans effectively. There's also an opportunity in these NDCs to explain how each country will align its institutional arrangements for managing their efforts to address climate change and biodiversity loss in a holistic way. I think there is much more attention to the need for building synergy between biodiversity management and climate action. And I hope that we will see at COP16 and at COP29 in Baku more attention to how each country and global institutions can align their action plans. But this can be outlined in some detail in the nationally determined contribution document to show how, say, for instance, work on national biodiversity action plans and nationally determined contributions can be aligned at the national level. And finally, the NDC can identify and explain the policy linkages that exist between NDCs and other domestic and international policy frameworks for protecting wildlife and biodiversity, which is building on what I outlined in the previous slide. So these are just 10 guidelines that we believe would be useful for each country to consider following in order to integrate biodiversity and specifically wildlife conservation and rewilding into their nationally determined climate action plans in order to supercharge climate change mitigation and adaptation at the national and local levels. These wildlife guidelines for NDCs will be published later this month, just prior to COP16. We will also be running, together with our colleagues at the Global Rewilding Alliance, a number of events at COP16 and at COP29, where we'll be exploring these issues in more detail. So if you would like a copy, please do get in touch with me. I can release an embargoed draft before we do the formal launch, but these will be available on the I4 website from in a week or two's time. So thank you, and back to you, Nelson.
Thank you so much, Simon, for such an engaging presentation. I can see so many comments in the chat box there. It's really amazing, and you know, an opportunity at the same time to see that not many countries have been looking at wildlife really as something that can be incorporated into their national climate action plans. And the guidelines, the 10 guidelines that you just provided, they give a really good base and foundation. I see some people are already asking about the availability, if they can have a PDF copy of your presentation and the guidelines. And thank you so much for stating that they will be made available just before COP16, so that people can actually take a look at them and see how they can implement them in their respective countries. The next presentation is going to be about one particular country in Africa, Zimbabwe, which has started implementing and also incorporating wildlife conservation and restoration issues into their NDCs. But before we go there, I would also just like to highlight and just let everyone know that we are going to be running 2 speakers short due to network issues. Unfortunately, we had 1 speaker from Angola and 1 from Kenya who were supposed to be joining and speaking to us about this particularly interesting topic. But unfortunately, they won't be able to make it for today. So we will have to make do with the excellent speakers that we have on call today. I will at this time hand over the time to Professor Patience Gandiwa from Zimbabwe, who will be presenting to us about the link between wildlife conservation and climate action in Zimbabwean national policy. Over to you, Professor Patience Gandiwa.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction and for earlier speakers. I think this topic is very interesting, and for us as a country, Zimbabwe, it's not a matter of choice that or preference that we must, or it would be ideal, or it would be a nice thing to actually leave.
I think we've lost Patience there for a second. Please.
Wildlife conservation in the country, and now our ministry since last year, it's now called the Ministry of Environment, Climate and Wildlife. And I think this is for the first time in history that we have had a ministry which has got wildlife as the name. Previously, it was just environment and natural resources management, or environment, water and climate. But wildlife were never really put at that level where the ministry responsible for environment is easily associated, or you can actually see that government is putting a lot of importance in wildlife, which shows that even in terms of our policy deliverables and the national strategies that we are doing, and that the national strategies that we are pursuing, including the review of the wildlife
Seems like Professor Patience is having network challenges, but please bear with her. I'm sure she will be back again in a minute.
Audible?
Yes, Patience, you're back now. Thank you. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Patience. You're back now.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Patience, we can hear you very well. You can proceed with your presentation.
For the sake of time, so the wildlife rich resources that we have in Zimbabwe, they are playing a very important and critical role in terms of promoting nature-based solutions and diversification of livelihoods, particularly targeting those communities when we are going to be exploring and incubating innovative initiatives for unlocking the potential of the wildlife economy strategy. Just last year, as a country, Zimbabwe launched the first ever wildlife economy strategy. And within this strategy, there are a lot of nature-based solutions that have got a feedback loop into our climate action plan at national level, and even the recovery and the national action plan that we have, which also is chained to the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, which we currently are reviewing, and we're hoping to complete this process by February next year. We were thinking that maybe by now we will be done, but this is a very iterative process which involves a lot of stakeholder participation, and we already putting targets at national level that speak to our wildlife resources, because it's something that we also have in abundance, and Zimbabwe has already dedicated a significant amount of land status, or where wildlife conservation is a recognized land use, close to 28%. And in these areas, we are promoting transfrontier conservation areas, which are multiple land use areas where sustainable wildlife conservation and also resilience planning and building is being pursued. Currently, we are implementing the Resilience Anchors project in the southeastern Lowveld, but we are also working with other partners in the northwest part of the country, and also in the Zambezi Valley. In the northwest part of the country, we are working with diverse partners, updating general management plans, incorporating to make it easy for practical implementation and practical action at local level. Whilst we have these provisions at policy and national level, what's important is also having a mechanism of linking policy to practice at protected area or at integrated land use level. We have what we call integrated development plans, where we also interface with other planning authorities or the local rural district councils within what we call transfrontier conservation areas, where we envision the future and plan also, but making sure that we have got specific targets and also baselines that are captured, so that we are able to assess whether we are making progress with regards to also even issues that relate to adaptation to climate change and also resilience building. We know there's been a growing body of knowledge which has been I think widely published now, which is demonstrating that wildlife is they're not only victims of climate change, but they're also players in the carbon cycle, which have got a ripple effect on the carbon sequestration potential of the ecosystems. However, we know that in our context, we do have thresholds of potential concern where, depending on densities for mega herbivores, this is why we actually have what we call the National Elephant Management Plan, which then also becomes the reference policy document, which is assisting us to know what to do, responding to needs of the socio-ecological system in a spatially explicit way, because we do have different populations of mega herbivores that have got different needs, and our actions on the ground actually respond to these different needs of the socio-ecological context of our populations. So we know now, at least it's good that, of course, sometimes people might see as having a huge population of elephants, such as Zimbabwe, with the second largest population of elephants in the world, and several other mega herbivores. Instead of seeing it through a different lens, that it could be burdensome or it could be damaging to the environment, we now appreciate the positive side of having this population and also the different species that interact differently with their environment at different scales. So it's very important, but there's still a lot more that we need to do so that there is improved access to climate financing or to carbon markets, but also it's within the framework of our national biodiversity strategy and also the wildlife economy strategy to unlock the potential of biodiversity credits. We need the national natural capital accounting system to be in place. But what's important is now that we have this provision already in our policy framework, and what the next steps will be to unlock that and you have mechanism and incubate new solutions innovatively that are suitable to our actions. And of course, yes, our targets at high level will obviously have to include a wildlife component, because we're already placing a lot of importance on wildlife. We have a growing population of also rhinos, which are also mega herbivores and hippo. And we incubating solutions and crafting mechanisms that suit our context at local level and within protected area management plan frameworks, which becomes also the framework which guides our intervention measures at landscape level and also at individual protected areas as core anchors that will see us unlock this potential. So we are at an experimental stage, and we are very excited about this opportunity and the power and the role of science, how it can actually influence policy and open up some new frontiers and opportunities that we never thought about previously. I don't know, maybe I feel like I've spoken a lot, and I'm not sure if I am audible because my computer is telling me that I have an unstable connection. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Patience Kaliwa. We could hear you really well at the end after you switched off the video. It's amazing what the government of Zimbabwe, as per your presentation, is doing towards aligning the NDCs with wildlife conservation, and it's something we hope we'll be seeing across the whole continent, across Africa. Governments jumping on board, taking on board even the guidelines as presented by Simon, and integrating these key discussions and key issues into climate action. At this moment, I think we will now open the floor to any questions. We will get into our question and answer segment, which will be facilitated by Simon. And if there are any questions, please do feel free to post in the chat box or to raise your hand if you might like to actually present in person. Simon, over to you. Shall we start with some of the questions that were being posted in the chat box, while we wait for any takers who might raise their hands?
Yes, please. I think you may be seeing some questions that I'm not seeing. Is there anything that has struck you that we should be asking from the chat? Nelson?
I think there was one interesting question from Susan Canny, and she was asking, I think this one was more addressed to Maheen. How do we reconcile the fact that the understory with elephants contains more carbon, but the previous presentation said that forest elephants had less understory vegetation? So I think this was for Maheen, and also the presentation which Andrew had made earlier.
Yeah, Andrew, would you like to kind of give us a sense of your response to that? You've already written something in the chat, but
yeah, sure. I think the general response would be like taking a step back, I didn't touch upon this in my presentation, but obviously animals in ecosystems is a very complex topic because ecosystems are so complex. And so there are situations, so animals are not going to contribute to carbon storage in ecosystems in every conceivable situation. I think that's safe to say. The general picture from the Animating the Carbon Cycle work is that on average, in the very big picture, in the grand scheme of things, healthy animal populations increase carbon storage capacities through contributing to healthy ecosystems. So that's the first big point I would make. Kind of getting more into the specific example, I'd have to really look at the data and kind of think about this. Off the top of my head, from this paper that I showed earlier, there was a kind of a parabolic curve that showed that the effects of elephants interacting with their environment and increasing carbon storage capacities increases to a certain point and then decreases. So I think the answer to this question, the specific question, is that it's an issue of densities. To a certain density, and elephants will contribute to carbon storage in these ecosystems, but too many and you start to have the opposite effect. So off the top of my head, that's, I think, the best answer I can give without digging into this more in depth. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Yeah, and that raises the very important question about how to effectively manage elephant populations to maintain correct densities so that we can maximize the potential for animating the carbon cycle. Do you have any kind of thoughts on those kind of management approaches? Like how can we start to reconfigure our approaches to wildlife management in very practical ways that can help us to maximize the potential from animating the carbon cycle? So making our, let's say, our conservation climate smart, perhaps in a way that is not yet really being integrated into management planning.
Can I comment on that, Simon?
Oh yes, please, Patience. Yes.
Thank you very much. I think we all know that wildlife, they don't know boundaries, and they are a fugitive resource that moves across boundaries. And when I say boundaries, not only international boundaries, but even across boundaries of different land uses. And because sometimes human beings, through their actions, they actually put virtual boundaries, which then increases densities of these mega herbivores that should be moving across the different.
Maybe if you can turn off your video, Patience, I think
and also create the room for these species that are migratory to actually transcend or transverse these boundaries in response to various needs for habitat, for to be deliberate in our approach and intention, and plan even beyond the TFCAs themselves, because sometimes we're thinking that the TFCA scope is large enough, but I think we have to dream bigger and actually have a bigger vision of how we can also repopulate, how can we remove barriers to ensure effective movement or cyclical movements of wildlife from one area.
Oh, I think we may have lost Patience altogether. So what we were hearing there from Professor Gandiwa was the importance.
I got kicked out. Apologies, my connection is very unstable.
No, thank you, Patience. No, that was really useful and interesting to and to hear the focus there on building connectivity between habitats for elephants in particular. Is something that's very close to I4's heart, as you know. I4 is a close partner with Zim Parks in Zimbabwe on managing certain protected areas, and our vision is very much along the lines that Professor Gandiwa was outlining there, in terms of ensuring that we can build connectivity between elephant habitats in order to reinforce the resilience of elephant populations to climate change, so that in conditions of drought or increasing climate stress, they're able to find the space and the resources that they need in order to be resilient. But equally to do that in a way that is working with communities, so that communities as well are able to benefit from the ecosystem services and also the benefits that come from the wildlife economy as a result. A key part of that for us, which is very important across Eastern and Southern Africa, is also working to help reduce and to mitigate wildlife-human conflict in ways that can ensure that these that landscapes are resilient and safe, both for wildlife and for people. So taking a holistic view, I think, is becoming increasingly important. To build on the elephant conversation, we've also had a question about the challenges of, say, taking the data and the learning that we have from forest elephants and applying that to savanna elephants. Obviously, very different species in very different ecosystems. I don't know, Maheen, if you at WWF have been thinking about the carbon sequestration potential of savanna elephants, whether you see this as being something that is transferable, or Andrew, if you've got any kind of insights into the challenges of doing the modeling or thinking about the potential with different types of elephants in Africa, or what we need to do in order to kind of build our database, as it were, across keystone species in a variety of different ecosystems.
I think perhaps I will let Andrew answer that question. So for us at WWF, this was a first sort of stake at looking into the interaction between wild animals and climate mitigation, and of course resilience and adaptation as well. So we are hopefully looking, once we can get these peer reviewed and get the responses and try and understand by engaging different stakeholders on this conversation, to enlarge our scope.
Thank you, Maheen. Andrew, any thoughts on this?
Sorry, I had to step away for a second. Can you rephrase that question?
Yeah, so the question was about the extent to which we can build on the forest elephant research to think about the carbon sequestration potential of savanna elephants. Mm-hmm. Do we have any kind of good data on that? Is that work that needs to be done? And there's a broader question then about how we can move from the data that you've presented to getting data that is useful for other keystone species globally. And maybe there's something you could say about the hotspots work that that you and GRA are working on.
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer is that I don't know of any evidence or research going on right now that's looking at the impact of elephants in savanna ecosystems. Doesn't mean to say it's not happening, but I certainly haven't seen anything from the literature. I think the question of how transferable kind of specific case studies are it's a complex question that needs some kind of careful thought, and ultimately it's going to be context specific. And so I would be hesitant to take the lessons of kind of that we've seen today about elephants and forest ecosystems and transfer that too directly to a different environment with different animals and kind of different vegetation communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because I think we need to look at kind of the specifics of each of these ecosystems and their animal communities. So I would be hesitant to transfer that too much. And I think we need more research to really look at that specific context. And then, yeah, I think that speaks to a reason why we need more scientific research, not just for elephants and savanna ecosystems, but for, you know, all of the other ecosystems around the world that have the potential to feed into this this more quantitative framework. So in a way, I would issue a kind of a call to action that we need scientists from all parts of the planet to try to get the hard data that we can use to feed into these models. Without that data from these different ecosystems, ultimately we're building castles in the air. We have to have that data. So if you're a scientist and listening to this this presentation, then please think about using some of your skills to give us the data we need to feed into that more quantitative framework. And then finally, just there is a kind of initiative that the Global Rewilding Alliance is trying to work on that is basically doing just that. It's expanding the scope and scale of the original kind of modeling approach that Oz Schmidt and colleagues led in 2023, and applying this to more ecosystems and more species, and really targeting in on the ecosystems and species communities that have the highest potential to kind of give the biggest carbon storage gains at a global scale. So that initiative is very much a work in progress, but it's built towards trying to put more concrete numbers to more ecosystems and species. And if anybody wants to know more about that, just reach out to me or Magnus or Carl. I'd be happy to talk to you about it, or even better, to involve you in that process.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Maheen.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. I wanted to add something, is that and build on what Andrew just also shared, is that for more research, scientific research in this area, what is also important is to engage in dialogues with stakeholders who work in those areas, and not, again, work in silos. The reason why WWF and we undertook this, we wanted to work with GRA and scientists at Yale University who led this study, is because how can we elevate, amplify, and enhance this work? I'm a policy person, so when I take these numbers to policymakers, or when I sit with negotiators, for example, at climate conferences, they want these numbers so that they can put this in the decision text, so that they can try and bridge the gap that persists regardless in biodiversity and climate discourses. So it is extremely important to get this research done. I'll give you an example. We've done 2 studies. So one in Romania in the Carpathian Mountains with the bison, as you know, and one in the Congo Basin with the forest elephants. And the difference in data availability in the 2 regions are quite noticeable. So this is also very important to understand that we need more data, we need to do more research, and without the data availability to understand these numbers, carbon sequestration, storage potential, these numbers obviously are not 100% accurate, but they help to bring these conversations forward to further fund research projects, and therefore not stay in silos any longer. And the other thing that I wanted to add was, with your presentation, Simon, about the NDCs, we also have to remember that we have the NBSAPs this year, and we also have the national adaptation plans next year. So at WWF, I'm engaged with a few other NGOs in trying to also bridge that gap in national policy instruments. So getting synergies between NBSAPs, NAPs, and NDCs, because ultimately we are targeting a North Star here. And we have to align our work, we have to talk to each other, and we have to see what is missing, identify those gaps, and therefore bridge those gaps. So hopefully this webinar and the numbers that we present, which are conservative numbers, conservative estimates, will try and get all of us to enhance this conversation going forward. I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, thank you, Maheen. Really important points. And I think that this is very consistent with what we are recommending, is that, as you will have seen in our guidelines, that the first step is really to acknowledge the potential that certain species would have, but also to attempt to start building the data bases that we need in order to actively make evidence-based choices around how we manage wildlife conservation and rewilding in ways that can deliver the potential of certain animals, and being able to identify the animals that are valuable for that. Just to build on what Andrew was saying there about working on some hotspots analysis, we are IFAW is collaborating with GRA to develop plans for this in ways that we will actively be seeking to do what Maheen was saying there, which would be to work closely with stakeholders in key countries to build relationships between scientists and decision makers in countries to do active action research, so that this is not kind of scientific research that's just being used to produce academic papers, but that is actively working to integrate evidence into the decision making in that joined up way that Maheen correctly suggested. So we are reaching the end of our time. I'd like to thank you for your questions and for your engagement. I'll hand back over to our chair, Nelson, to close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. It seems like we definitely would need more time, more webinars, and more spaces to discuss these interesting conversations. And I hope this is just, the start to us talking about these restoration, climate action issues and conversations across Africa with this first webinar that we have hosted. I think from the various presentations that we have heard, it does come along like a call of action as well, that in as much as wildlife conservation has not really been seen as a mainstream solution to the climate crisis that we're currently facing, much needs to be done, whether it's in terms of advocacy, whether it's in terms of engaging policymakers when they get to do and have these key discussions like the ones we're going to be having in Cali, because climate action and wildlife conservation, they are not separate at all, based on the presentations and the case studies we've heard from Zimbabwe, from the Congo as well. And if we manage to get more governments acting like the government of Zimbabwe in terms of getting their policies aligned to the NDCs under the Paris Agreement, more can be achieved in terms of realizing the Paris Agreement deals that were made in terms of reductions and achievements that need to be done. I think it is also key to highlight that as we are going to Cali, we will be having side events from our partner organizations like IFAW, and as the Global Rewilding Alliance, we also will be there. If any of the participants are going to be in Cali for COP16, please do reach out so that we can connect and continue having these conversations and guidance on how we can mainstream these discussions into national policies and even international policies at the COP spaces. As we come to the end, I would like to just thank the speakers and everyone who's managed to join us for this webinar. Let's stay in touch. Please do share your emails, and if we have anything to share, we will be doing so and inviting you to more discussions and webinars as well. Otherwise, as the time is coming to an end, thank you so much for this interesting discussion. Looking forward to more conversations in the future.